A university graduation. A university graduation is a very auspicious occasion. Every instance of graduation marks an important passage in people's lives. Today marks an especially singular passage toward independent life in the lives of our graduates. As a parent myself, I have experienced 3 times the simultaneously bitter and sweet feelings that accompany this passage. I'm sure that many of the parents in this room are feeling that wonderfully strange mixture of sadness and pride that comes with watching yesterday's children become tomorrow's adults. Impressively independent, impressively competent, and as unlikely as that may have even seemed in the past, maybe even impossible as that has seemed in the past, this passage is taking place, and it's a wonderful thing to see. It can be hard for parents to watch their children becoming independent and taking flight, going off on their own. For parents who are having trouble with that transition, I offer one possible compensation, one possible solace. You should think how much worse it would be if that did not take place. TTU University opened just a few years ago after earlier years of planning and work to establish Vietnam's first private not-for-profit university, modeled generally after American universities, and modeled specifically in some aspects after Rice University in Houston. I am a professor of physics and astronomy at Rice University. As you heard, I previously served for 10 years as provost of the university. I made the decision to start a life in science, specifically a life in physics, when I was in junior high school, in the 8th grade. I did not decide which area of physics to pursue until I was in graduate school. I chose theoretical astrophysics because I could think of no more exciting way to spend my life than to try to figure out how the world works and how the world came into existence. Along the way, I was somehow drawn into other activities and jobs, including serving on many advisory and governing boards for science programs and for science policy, serving in several leadership positions in several universities, and it was in that context that I met and got to know Madame Yen and became involved as a member of the board of this university. The TTU Board of Trustees is a group of individuals who have agreed as a public service to act as the governors of the university. The Board of Trustees is dedicated to working with the founder of the university, Madame Hoang Yen Thi Dang, to help guide the university on its path, a path of development to be eventually among the leading universities in Vietnam and the world. I'm pleased to be able to say, as you have heard, that I'm not the only TTU board member present this afternoon. Another board member, Mr. Michael Michalik, is also here. Mr. Michalik is the former United States ambassador who previously represented the United States in Vietnam. Mr. Michalik is accompanied to this ceremony by Mr. Michalik is accompanied by Mrs. Michalik. I'm also accompanied to this ceremony by my favorite person, Dr. Erzsébet Morény, also a professor at Rice University and an expert in computer intelligence, the science of making computers analyze information in ways that resemble the human brain. Additionally, I'm delighted that Elizabeth Gillis is present today along with members of her family. Elizabeth is the wife of the late Malcolm Gillis, who, as you have heard and you know, died a year ago, just before the first commencement of TTU University. Dr. Gillis was chairman of the TTU Board of Trustees and made important contributions. We all miss him. I want to say just a few words about Madame Yen. TTU exists because of her vision. Unfortunately, she's not able to be here, but I bring you her greetings. Madame Yen started her working career as a government employee in Vietnam. Her job was to help private companies from outside of Vietnam understand the advantages of locating manufacturing facilities here in this lovely country, and to help the companies establish such factories. While doing that work, Madame Nguyen saw the opportunity for private developers to develop industrial parks. And she decided to devote her effort, after building a fortune in that real estate business, she decided to devote her effort and fortune to establishing a great university in Vietnam. Her vision is animated by an abundant public spirit to serve the best interests of the nation and the people of Vietnam. When I asked Madame Nguyen to tell me originally what inspired her to want to establish a university, she told me that her father was a big influence in her life. She told me that her father had always spoken of the importance of continuing education throughout life, and that he had pursued his own education, even as an adult, after he had children and had established his professional career. She wanted to help bring to Vietnam the highest quality of educational opportunities to all Vietnamese citizens. One of the challenges of being a speaker at an event like this is to try to decide what to say. I want to tell you two stories. At the beginning, the stories may sound disconnected, but I hope you will soon see that these stories are not as disconnected as they may at first seem. I've told these stories before in similar gatherings to other graduating classes and other groups of students. It has always seemed to strike a resonant chord. Indeed, so much so that on many occasions I've been asked by students to hear these stories again. Many years ago, at the beginning of my career, I shared an office with a guy who was a very serious technical mountain climber. As someone myself who never understood why people climb mountains, I probed him to try to understand and discover his motivation for climbing. This guy was a serious enough mountain climber to nearly lose his life climbing in the Andes Mountains in South America. He was lucky to get out alive. In fact, he was much luckier than another friend of mine who just a few years later was killed climbing mountains in the Himalayas of the Indian Kashmir. I eventually understood the motivation and attraction of mountain climbing after I learned about the concept of exposure. Exposure, to a mountain climber at least, is good. For those who do not know what exposure is, let me explain it in the simple and crude way that I understand it. Basically, the less that is underneath you, the less support you have, the more exposed you are, and the better that's supposed to be. Many people, especially mountain climbers, seek exposure. Others just put up with it. As I stand here on this stage, the entire half of space underneath me is filled up with stuff, with the floor, with the ground. There's no exposure here, at least as far as a mountain climber is concerned. If I were to be standing instead at the edge of a very steep precipice, at the cliff top of a very deep canyon, that still would not be significant exposure to a mountain climber. The fact that I would be frightened is not important to a mountain climber. To a mountain climber, being afraid of heights is not a very impressive thing. However, if I were to cling to the side of the wall 1,000 meters off of the ground, clinging by my fingertips to the side of a sheer wall, that would be exposure. And that begins to be exciting for a mountain climber. Exciting even for a mountain climber. But it would not be the best possible kind of exposure because still, underneath me, half of the space would be filled up with stuff, the side of the cliff. The best possible exposure is if I were to cling by my fingertips to the underside of the ceiling 1,000 meters above the ground, or even better, to a rock overhang 1,000 meters off the ground. That would be the kind of exposure that a mountain climber seeks. That is real and exciting exposure. Exposure is valued in mountain climbing because it offers the satisfaction of accomplishing something difficult without the support and without the security that we all normally need and crave. Most of us are satisfied to live without that kind of exposure. Most of us do not seek it, and many of us try to avoid it. I certainly do. Now I want to tell you another story. This is the story of a man I knew, a professor at the university where I went to graduate school, the University of Chicago. I read a book about him one time. It was a biography. The man is named Subramanian Chandrasekhar. The book, the biography, was not an especially good book. My main interest in reading it was because while I was a graduate student, I had spent 4 years in an office just down the hall, actually 3 years, in an office just down the hall from Chandrasekhar. Chandra was one of the greatest astrophysicists in the history of the world. In 1983, at the age of 73, he won the Nobel Prize in physics. He won it for work that he had done 53 years earlier as a young man at the age of 20 on the boat, traveling from India, actually it was then India and Pakistan, traveling from India to Cambridge University in England to begin graduate school. While he was on the boat, he made this remarkable discovery, which when he arrived at Cambridge, he told people about. And when he told people about it, they ridiculed him. They thought it was ridiculous. They thought he was a stupid person. And in fact, during his time at Cambridge, Chandra was ridiculed by all of the giants, almost all of the giants of astrophysics. It took many years before the significance of his work was recognized and before it was recognized as a profound discovery that altered our ideas about how the universe is put together. By that point, his work was widely appreciated, and he won the Nobel Prize in 1984. Chandra was by any measure a remarkable human being, certainly one of the most remarkable human beings I have ever known. Today, his work done at the age of 20, stands as one of the landmarks in the development of human knowledge and in human understanding of the universe. One of the things in the book that struck me especially was a quote at the very end of the book. That quote was contained in a recorded interview that the author of the book did with Chandrasekhar after he had won the Nobel Prize and while the book was being written. In that conversation, Chandra said, and I want to emphasize, this was at the age of 84, at that point 74, when he had already won the Nobel Prize. And Chandra said, even at this stage of my life, when I send in a publication for a paper for publication, I constantly worry whether the editors will accept it. This is after he had won the Nobel Prize, after he was recognized as one of the most famous and accomplished scientists in the history of the world. Think about that. It was often said about Chandrasekhar that he never wrote the first book in any subject. He only wrote the last book in any subject. That after he wrote the book, there was nothing more to say in that subject. He served for 20 years as the editor-in-chief of the leading astrophysical journal in the world, the Astrophysical Journal, an American journal, but the best in the world. And yet, he says, approaching the age of 80, even at this stage in my life, when I send in a publication, I constantly worry whether it will be accepted. In his quote, Chandrasekhar expresses the feeling of exposure. He expresses the anxiety that accompanies producing something new, producing something innovative, the anxiety of being out front, alone in front of the crowd. What Chandra acknowledges here is that to accomplish something significant or to accomplish something important, one must be willing to be exposed. Without a willingness to accept exposure, potential for truly significant accomplishment is squashed. Our society in the world faces continuing large and real challenges. Your society in Vietnam faces large and real challenges. Some among you will emerge as leaders when it comes time for your generation to assume responsibility for society. Perhaps leaders in business, leaders in education, leaders in politics, perhaps leaders in some other realm. To make the highest and best use of your education, to be a leader in a way that means something, whether it's intellectual leadership in scientific work as it was for Chandrasekhar, or leadership in other endeavors, you will need to find within yourself the willingness to accept exposure and take appropriate risks. Not for private thrills like mountain climbing. I don't encourage mountain climbing, even with the exposure. But exposure and risks for good, constructive, and well thought out purposes. I urge you to think about this because leadership from informed and well-educated individuals such as yourselves will be among the most valuable resources in society. The most valuable resources in the society that you are about to inherit. And real leadership requires, along with creativity, imagination, and energy, a willingness to accept constructive exposure for constructive purposes. In closing, I want to remind you of just one or two things. I want to remind you that learning must be a lifelong activity. It must continue to be a part of your lives, that you cannot, none of you, regard today as the end of your education. As important as college is, there is ever more to learn. That was always true, and it is all the more true today as the pace of change in the world and in all of our societies, this one, the United States, and all of our societies, the pace of change is accelerating, and we need to learn how to welcome and embrace it. We live in a world increasingly enriched and increasingly challenged by the industries of knowledge. Science and science-based technology have shaped major aspects of modern life. I expect that such advances will continue. The benefits that you will see in the next decades will far surpass even those advances that you have seen up to now. Science and technology bring into our lives, what science and technology bring into our lives is ethically neutral. It can be used for bad or for good things. These days we pay a lot of attention to technological and economic progress, but we must pay an equal amount of attention to social progress. The total progress of our society requires that we strive to ensure that the benefits, the wealth, and the well-being of our society are distributed equitably and used to advance a wise and informed sense of the broad public interest. You who are graduating today have benefited from a university committed to advancing your knowledge and your skills, your understanding. As you go about your future lives, I urge that you give thought to the role that you can play in advancing the lives, the knowledge, and the understanding of others. As you have been educated, you must also play the role of educators throughout your life. Also remember that there is a vast reservoir of talent and potential contribution that lies untapped in segments of society who, for one reason or another, have not had your opportunity, who have not understood that they have opportunity. And I urge that you devote some part of your lives to providing opportunity for those who have not had it so far. It will benefit all of us. Finally, I want to admonish you in a more personal way. The formal part of your university education has focused mostly on intellect, on analysis, and creative cognitive skills. You need also to develop your emotional skills, your emotional intelligence along with your intellect. Hard work, compassion, and emotion, as well as human and humane relationships. Do those things, and you are likely to be successful in whatever you do. Lastly, please remember that you bear the responsibility for your own lives. I want to close with a quote from the Spanish philosopher and writer José Ortega y Gasset. He wrote, "We are each here to write, produce, and act out our own drama. We are each of us unique. We can choose every day what we are going to do. We can make our life a work of art. You can make your life a work of art, and you are the only one who can do it. I want to congratulate all of today's graduates and wish you a happy, productive, and rewarding life. Thank you very much.